Well, it's good to be with you this morning as we continue our journey through the book of Mark. And I was thinking over the last month or so, we've had a great time in our house. So we got to celebrate a couple birthdays. My daughter's birthday last week and my wife's birthday. And it was February or January 24th. We went out to eat at Timetable here locally in Bay, which is a really, really cute restaurant. And it was really, really cold. Like, if you remember that day, it was very, very cold. But we decided, you know what, we haven't had a night together, date night, so let's do it. And we had an amazing time. The food was amazing. We ordered, what was it? Cheddar lobster tots. Yeah. It's like my favorite food, lobster, and my kids' favorite food mixed, the tater tots. It was very good. We had a great time together. And I was thinking food is such a gift from God. Ecclesiastes, you can read that in Proverbs, talking about how food is a gift, right? God created with such great creativity that he created animals and plants and herbs and spices, and humans have such great creativity to create these amazing dishes, and to enjoy them together is such a gift. As we were continuing to eat dinner together, because it was so cold, they made some house mulled wine, which is like hot, heated up wine with spices. I didn't know what it was. I had to ask. And they came around to the tables and they gave it out on the house. And man, it was awesome. It was delicious. And I thought, as I'm thinking about it, food and wine, a gift from God, right? That God created fruits and a process by which you create this beverage. And I'll be honest, if my younger self who grew up Baptist heard me say that from the pulpit, he'd be a little freaked out. It was grape juice in my church. But man, what a gift, right? And as you read this text and you read about the list of things that are listed off, and you think about sexual immorality, but when you think about the gift of sex, that God created man and woman and created sex to be for both procreation and pleasure, that it was a gift for human beings to enjoy and to procreate and to have children. Man, it is a good gift. Food, wine, sex, things created by God in the correct purpose to be good. But there's also ways in which the good gifts of God can become perverted because of the fall, can become twisted, whether food becomes an idol, as Paul says, their idol became their stomachs, right? Or gluttony and with alcohol, to abuse the substance to the point of drunkenness, right? The Bible warns that there are ways in which these things can be used in their improper place. Or sexuality, which can become used in all kinds of ways that are problematic and perverse. And these good gifts given to the Christian for those to live and to use also have another side to them. And not only that, man, these gifts should point us to the created one. Right? As a believer, we have the gift of being able to eat together and drink together. And in that, there is a pointing to the Creator, the one who created it. All these gifts can be used for God's glory, and yet oftentimes they're used in other ways. Interestingly, those three things, Jesus says yes to all those, but he also says there's something else that people run to, another vice, a thing that actually might even be more dangerous than those things I just listed. And in this passage, you're going to see Jesus confront what happens when religion becomes a thing that is twisted. And more specifically, man-made religion, and when that becomes an idol. And to explain what we're talking about, because you may hear the word religion and think, well, aren't we a religion? And the answer is yes. But here's what happens with man-made religion. Right? People tend to want to earn the favor of God, and so they think we can do that by having a list of rules and a list of check marks, that if we do these things, that somehow we're going to tip the scales of God's favor towards us. Be a good man, be a good woman, and then God will bless me. I can put God in my debt by behaving a certain way. See, that's describing a religion that is outside in. And yet what Jesus talks about is actually the truth of the gospel is about being inside out. And so today's scriptures come from the book of Mark. We're in verses 14 through 23. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn there. If you don't have a Bible, there are Bibles in the pew in front of you. You're welcome to use those. And if you don't own a Bible, you can take that as a gift to you. With this passage, as we're looking through the book of Mark, we come to this controversy that Jesus has with the religious leaders of the time. It's about clean ritual purity laws. And there are dietary laws that people live by. There are regulations that people had to do. And it's tempting to think and to look at this that, well, this controversy really doesn't have much relevance for us today because we don't have these, right? I mean, when you walk into church this morning, our greeters aren't there being like, did you shower this morning? Did you brush your teeth? Did you floss? Right? There's no checkpoint that you have to get through to come to church. But in the time and place in which this was written, there were certain expectations and certain laws that people had to abide by in order to go to the temple. And so I would argue, though, however, even though we don't have those same ritual purity laws, I think the heart of what Jesus is trying to teach is the same then as it is today. And the first big idea here is the simple reality that all of us have a sense of uncleanliness. We know that deep down there is a part of us that is unclean. And the hard thing and the thing that Jesus is going to try to confront is that no matter how hard we try, we cannot cleanse ourselves. It is only through Jesus that we can find this cleansing. And so the first point is this: all of us have a sense of being unclean. And this cleanliness metaphor goes beyond just the physical, but take the physical, for example. I don't know if you've ever been in a place where you were so dirty, you just needed to take a shower, like you could smell yourself, you could have dirt all over. I remember one particular instance. I was on a road trip to Aspen, Colorado, where we went hiking with 4 of my college buddies, and we hiked for 4 days in the Maroon Bells, right? It was this beautiful hike. It was amazing, stayed overnight. But that's also 4 days of no showering, heat, sweat, exhaustion, and then all 4 of us got into my little Chevy Prism, which is not a big car, and we drove 11 hours back to Kansas. I think my car smelled for like months after that. But I'll never forget when I got home, first thing I did was I went and I took a hot shower. And there was no greater feeling than just to feel all of the sweat and everything that had, all the dirt just fall off of my body. And I think I washed my hair like 3 times, just kept finding stuff in there, you know. And after just taking a shower, feeling clean, there was no greater feeling. In this passage, as we're looking at this idea of uncleanliness, there's a physical element to it. In the Mosaic clean laws, if you touched anything dead, so a dead animal, a dead body, if you had an infectious skin disease or a rash or a sore, if you came into contact with mildew, your clothes in your home, or if you had any kind of bodily discharge, or even if you ate something like a pig, if you had pork or bacon or anything, right, that came from an unclean food, you were then considered defiled, unclean. And in order to become clean, there would have to go through a certain ritual. And it meant that when you were unclean, that you could not go to the temple, right? You were ostracized from the community, which was the gathering of people at the temple. You could not go and worship God in community. And that was a big deal. But this idea of cleansing, sort of washing yourself clean, was not just for the physical. There was also an element of spiritual and moral that was attached to it. So think about it in these terms. If you were going to go on a date with someone, you're trying to impress them, or you were going to go to a special event or a wedding or something, right? Most of us would want to shower and clean ourselves and floss our teeth and maybe take some mouthwash or something right before going out on this date or this event. And we do so because we want to present the best version of ourselves. We don't want to go into it smelling weird or whatever. That's an important part of the process. We don't want a speck on us of dirt. But God says it's the same way with me, that spiritually and morally, unless you are clean, you cannot come into the presence of a holy God. And this goes back to the Old Testament, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But I want you to consider something in this passage. Jesus disagrees with the religious leaders on 2 fundamental issues. The first is about the source of our uncleanliness. Right? He disagrees on what the source is, where it comes from. And the second thing he disagrees with is what we're supposed to do with our uncleanliness. So it's the source of our uncleanliness and what it is that we're supposed to do with it. But interestingly, there's these 2 things we have here. There's also something that he agrees with, like it's common ground. He's like, you and I, we actually see eye to eye on this thing. And that is, Jesus agrees about the reality that we are indeed unclean. He agrees. He's like, yes, we are unclean. And we are unclean before God. We are not fit for the presence of God. We'll read this in verse 16. He says, the things that come out of a person are what defile him. Or in the NIV translation, it says, what comes out of a man makes him unclean. In the end of verse 23, all these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. He is saying, look, we are indeed unclean. And he differs on a number of issues with the religious leaders, but in that in particular, it's kind of an understanding, right? It's an assumption that we're unfit for the presence of God according to Jesus. In our natural state, we're unfit. Here's I think the temptation. The temptation is to look at a passage like this and think, well, these were ancient people, right? They had an ancient understanding of the world. Many of them felt a need to appease the god or gods, right? And they had a certain standard of moral behavior that they had to live by, or else the gods might smite them. Okay, so there was a certain understanding of the world. And I think the temptation for us to be like, well, we've evolved since then. We've got it figured out. We don't need the same sort of frame for viewing the world. But I think we have a different kind of spirit of our age, right? 2026, what is the spirit of our age? Does anybody really know about God for certain? Right? That you may have heard the phrase, truth, my truth is truth, right? What is truth? It's whatever I want it to be. We decide for ourselves. There's a sense of moral relativism. Everybody's got to come up with their own standards, and I will judge you based off my own standards, right? And we believe in the right of the individual and human dignity and all these things, but we don't see the sort of clean, unclean dynamic. I would argue the spirit of the age is that human nature is basically good. I think we're tempted to think that we have somehow evolved morally, that as a species, we've gotten to this place where we've got it figured out and we've arrived at a certain level of morality. But I think we've been, according to what we're going to see, I think we're really mistaken. To explain this a little further, there's a great book. It was written by a named Franz Kafka. He's a 20th century thinker, brilliant, really weird, but really brilliant. And I actually watched the movie version of this. I read the book and watched the movie for a class on theology and film in seminary. It was a really cool class. This is one of those instances, though, where the book is way better than the movie, and I think you'll understand why. I'll describe the plot really briefly. Basically, the plot of the book is that there's a guy named Joseph. The main character is having a normal life in the very beginning, but he's arrested and taken into custody. The problem is that when he's arrested, nobody tells him why. And so he's left to wonder, like, why in the world am I being arrested? You're not going to explain it to me. And everyone he meets in the book is very unsympathetic. Is very grumpy. He's just kind of like, yeah, whatever. Doesn't explain what's happening. And he's moved from one hearing to another, one group of people who have him detained to another, one cell to another, and he keeps trying to figure out, why am I being detained? And it gets to the point in the book where he begins to start to like second guess himself. Like, maybe I did something, right? Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe it was when I did this 3 years ago. Maybe it was when I crossed this person or said this thing. And he begins to try to think, what was it that I did that brought me here? And in the book, it ends by him getting killed by the warden and never finds out what happened. Very depressing. Probably why I didn't make a good movie. I watched the Orson Welles version. I was like, that was boring. But I think there is a powerful story here. And we read some of Kafka's diaries because I think this is one of the more fascinating things when he talks about the power of this story. He wrote this in his diary. He said, the state in which we find ourselves today is sinful, quite independent of guilt. We live in a world now where we don't believe in heaven or hell. We don't believe in sin. We don't have these categories. And yet, we still feel there's something wrong with us. And he continues to write, in spite of the fact we don't have these older categories, we still have this deep, profound, inescapable sense that if we were examined, that we wouldn't pass. You see, I think Kafka is really digging into something profound about the human experience. That on some level, there is this part of us that recognizes that we will never be enough, that we will never be good enough, that we are, even if we don't acknowledge it, even if we don't even have sin as a category, that we are still feeling this internal sense of what is right, what is wrong, that eternity is written on our hearts. And so let me ask you a few questions as you think about your life. Why do many of us work so hard? Put so much energy and time into our work to an unhealthy degree, to the point to where you may get to a certain level where you think you've arrived and then it's just not enough, right? We keep driving, we keep burning, we work late hours, and we work and work. What do you think is driving you? Why is it that some of us can't disappoint anyone, right? We fall into the trap of people pleasing. So much so that people end up taking advantage of us or trampling over us, because for you to disappoint someone might be worse than death itself. Right? Why do those things bother us? Where do these self-doubts come from? Kafka's argument is that we don't believe in sin, and we don't believe in heaven or hell, we don't believe in anything, and yet somehow deep down we know that we are unclean. Right? That somewhere deep down there is this internal unsettledness, this discontentment. And the scriptures actually have a lot of really clear teaching on this. Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God," right? The recognition that all of us have indeed sinned. There's a separation between us and God because of our sin. And so we're left with this problem, okay? Let's say we acknowledge that we're unclean. I think the problem for many of us then is that we're tempted to try and clean ourselves. And Jesus says it's not going to work. Look at verse 18 and 19. He says to the disciples, "Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean?" Or the ESV says, "defile them. If it doesn't go into the heart, but into his stomach and then out the body, it's from within that men's hearts comes evil." And so what Jesus is saying is rather simple. He's saying, look, man, what's wrong with us? The problem, the reason that we are unclean is not because of some outside force that's making you this way. Yes, there are temptations and things, but ultimately it begins with the heart. That's why Jesus has radical teachings on things like adultery, right? He says, if you've committed adultery, what? In person? No, he says, in your heart, then you've committed adultery. Right? He gets so hyperbolic in the way he talks about things because he knows that deep down it's within the heart. About a century ago, there's a famous newspaper in London, the Times, probably the most prestigious English newspaper of all time. They hosted a bunch of fascinating discussions and columns in its editorial pages. And at one point, the editors invited a bunch of well-known authors and thinkers to sort of give their 2 cents on very specific issues. And one of those issues was the question, what is wrong with the world? And the opinions that were thrown in were diverse. People had a lot of thoughts on this, and they pontificated these long, babbling things. But perhaps the most profound was by a Catholic by the name of G.K. Chesterton. And Chesterton was known for his kind of clear-headed wit, and he wrote a simple letter to the editors to answer the question. He wrote, "Dear sirs, I am." Signed, Chesterton. I think GK understood at the center, in an understanding of our humanity is at the heart, is what the scriptures tell us. It's deceitful. And he understands that ultimately, hey, there are a lot of things that we can point to that may be wrong with the world, but deep down it's the fact that humankind is sinful. Self-centeredness, all of it. And Jesus is saying that as hard as we try through washing and dietary laws and external things, as hard as we try to be good and deal with the heart that way, it's not going to work because we are approaching it from an outside-in method. And then he speaks really vividly in verse 18, 19. He says, "Do you not see whatever goes into a person from the outside cannot defile him, since it entered his heart, stomach, and is expelled?" That word expelled, it is what you think it means, right? It leaves the body. Okay, he says it literally is exiting the body. And so what he's saying is that the food comes in, but it does not actually get to the heart. It goes right through the body, into the mouth, into the stomach, and out. And you're not actually seeing transformation. He's saying that external behavior doesn't deal with the soul. All these things you're trying to do to cleanse yourself do not work. The outside in is not going to work. And I think the hard reality is many of us do this all the time without realizing it. We're trying to do something that Jesus is saying is impossible. And I want to give you some examples of this because I think it's helpful, because I see this play out in a few different ways. For one, I think religion itself, right? We use religion as a way to do this. Religion is an outside in. If I do these things, if I stay away from these TV shows and movies, if I stay away from bad activities, if I stay away from bad people, but if I pray, read my Bible, and try really hard to be good, if I do all these things on the outside, God will see me as worthy, come in and bless me, right? That's how our mind tends to be drawn to in using religion. Of course, Jesus says that model doesn't work. Christian Smith uses this term to define kind of the spirit of our age here, talking about how many of us have a kind of quasi-Christian worldview. He calls it moralistic therapeutic deism. It's kind of a fancy word if you want to write that down. Moralistic therapeutic deism. And what he's trying to describe here is this sort of many Americans and those in the West kind of have this relationship with faith that is moralistic, meaning our external behavior, right? The thing that we're trying to manage is our behavior, and that God exists to make us feel better. That's where the word therapeutic comes from, right? To feel good about ourselves, to be happy. And that God is a distant being who created the world but is not actively involved in our daily life. He's more like I think he called him a cosmic therapist or a divine butler, right? Who only exists in those moments when you really need him and call for him. But the reality is this: Jesus is not preaching moralistic therapeutic deism. The gospel could not be farther away from that. Because the gospel is the good news that our salvation does not come from our external behavior, but it comes from the person of Jesus Christ. And because of that, Christ actually changes our heart from the inside out, which allows us to live out the ways in which God has called us to live. It actually, when we live through religious oppression, what happens is it makes us more anxious because we're constantly wondering whether or not we are doing enough. Have we tipped the scales enough? And then when inevitably something bad happens to us, we question everything. We say, well, why would God allow this bad thing to happen to me when I've been living rightly? I've been doing these things. It's like when Jesus looked at the rich young ruler in Mark and says, look, the rich young ruler said, I've done all these things. What else do I need to do? And Jesus looks at him with compassion and says, one thing you lack. That's another sermon for future weeks. I'm not going to go into that. Here's the deal. Religion, outside in, doesn't work. There are other things, though, that I think can get in the way. I think politics, this is a big one, tends to work outside in. I was reading Tim Keller's commentary on Mark called King's Cross. It's a great, great book. But he was talking about how after World War II, there were a lot of these British intellectuals who had their entire worldview shattered by World War II. One of those was C.E.M. Joad, who was a British socialist. He was an agnostic or an atheist, a philosopher, didn't believe in God. But in 1952, right before he died, he wrote this book called The Recovery of Belief, in which he came back to belief in God. And here's what he said. He said, it was because we rejected the doctrine of original sin that we on the left were always being disillusioned. Both the behavior of people and the leaders were inexplicable to us because we didn't believe in sin. And then Lord David Cecil put it this way after the Holocaust in World War II. He said, the philosophy of progress had led us to believe that the savage and primitive was behind us, but it turns out it was within us. And now I think over the last 100, 150 years, like conservative and liberals, all of it have operated on this basis that really the thing that can change us is social structures or a lack of it fixing our education problem or applying religion and technology. We need to do these things to fix the problem. But ultimately, man, that's outside in. That's outside in. And it won't work. And so whatever ideology that we subscribe to, right, we need to be thinking and be careful that we don't miss the fact that Jesus is teaching us it's something different. I'll even give you one more example. This is a personal example for me. I would argue that ministry itself, right, can kind of become this outside-in thing. I took a lot of pride in the work I was doing at my last church as a youth minister. We had grown the youth group. Things were going really well. really well, actually. And then at one point, we went through this thing in 2020. It's a pandemic. It was really difficult for me, maybe for you as well. And I will tell you that during that time, our ministry really suffered. And not just suffered, I felt like a failure as a pastor. I felt like I was trying things. I was trying to get creative. We had Zoom youth groups. We did summer camp and indoors in a day, and it was just a mess, right? Nothing was working. And during that time, I was going through a real personal struggle. I would even say it was a bit of a depression, to the point to where I remember at one point I went to my boss's office, my pastor at the time, and I said, yeah, I just kind of described like my struggle and what I was feeling. And he asked me, he's like, what's going on with your soul? Like, what's really going on underneath all of this? And I remember after I shared a little bit about my experience, he said, Matt, I really believe that you are trying to justify yourself by your ministry success. I was like, I think he's right. And he ended up giving me 2 weeks of leave, paid leave. And he said, I want you to go take some time. I want you to meet with the spiritual director. And so I did. I took some time off away from ministry. I didn't even think about work. I met with a spiritual director and he prayed over me. And I remember something, I wrote it down, something my spiritual director said to me. He said, Matt, you need to know that regardless of what you do in your ministry, that you are loved by God and that you need to live out of that love and not your successes and failures. And man, it's like instant tears. I'm like, that's it. I mean, I'm constantly in this battle where I feel like I'm justifying my existence and my worth based on what I could accomplish. And the moment it wasn't working, the moment when I wasn't successful, man, it led me to this really dark place. And so I share that with all of you because I think all of us can fall into that trap, right? This outside in way of finding our worth and hope, whatever that might be for you. But there is a solution that Jesus points us to. If you look at verse 19, Mark, unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, rarely gives editorial comments, but he does here. You notice little parentheses that are in there. This is him giving his editorial comment. And it's really significant because Mark rarely does this. And so what does he say? He says, as of now, I make all foods clean. This is a big deal. In order to understand the magnitude of what Jesus is saying, you have to understand Jesus has a very high view of Scripture, okay? When I say Scripture, I'm referring to the Torah, to the Old Testament. He has it memorized. He knows what the Scriptures teach, and he has a very high view. And so what he's not saying is, I am doing away or abolishing all of these laws. In fact, he's saying something quite different, and I think more profound. He is saying, I have come to fulfill them. And we really see this if we go all the way back to the prophet Zechariah. If you have your Bibles, you're welcome to turn there with me. Chapter 3. Zechariah is one of the prophetic books in the Old Testament, and we're transported in chapter 3 to the center of the temple. And the first thing he sees in verse 1, it says, then the Lord showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the Lord. Now, in the prophecy, okay, you have to imagine, there's a little context for you for Zechariah. Once a year, okay, is the Day of Atonement, is when the high priest would go to the temple. The high priest of Israel would go to the temple. And at this time, there would be crowds of people, right? There were 3 levels to the temple. There was the outer courts, inner courts, and the Holy of Holies. And people would watch this ritual take place where the high priest, who was in seclusion for weeks, right, because he could not be defiled in any way, he was preparing himself to go into the Holy of Holies, which was a dangerous thing. Because if you went into the presence of God and had any speck of dirt, you had anything both physically, spiritually, or morally unclean, you might die. That happens. There's stories in the Old Testament. And so he spent time in seclusion, and eventually the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, and there were 3 elements to it. The first time he would go in, he would bathe in front of all these people, which is a little weird, but that's what he'd do. And then he would put on this white robe, and then he would go into the Holy of Holies. He would make a sacrifice on behalf of his own sin. And then he would get out. He would do it all over again. He would bathe. He'd put on new white linens, and he would go in and make a sacrifice on behalf of all the priests. And he would do it one last time, but this time and the final time it was for all people. The sacrifice was for everyone. And you had this great high priest make the sacrifice. So with that, Think about this prophecy. In Zechariah, we get this prophecy, and he goes before, he sees Joshua, right? Joshua is the great high priest in this story. And he's standing in front of the Holy of Holies, and he says, "But Joshua was dressed in garments covered in excrement." Not what Zechariah was expecting. Instead of the pure white linen, in this prophecy that he sees Joshua dressed in he has human waste all over his garments. And he's seeing this, and he's probably thinking, what in the world is happening? Everything in this process has been leading toward the high priest being clean, and yet in the prophecy, he's covered in excrement. And I think the reason why this prophecy is happening is God is giving Zechariah a moment, a prophetic vision that he could see us the way God sees us. That in spite of all of our efforts to be pure, all our efforts to try to be good, to be moral, to try to clean ourselves, that it will not work. And he sees that our hearts really are not as pure as we maybe try to project them to be. He sees the outside, right? But deep down, the Lord sees the heart. Then Zechariah realizes that we're unfit to be in the presence of God. And just as he's about to go into despair, here's the really good part of the prophecy. God says, the Lord spoke, he said, "Take off your filthy clothes." And he said, the high priest, "See, I take your sin off you so I can clothe you in costly garments." And he says, "I'm going to bring my servant the branch, and I'll remove the sin of the land in a single day." And in this moment, I think Zechariah couldn't believe it. He says, in a single day, you are going to take away all of the sin of the land. And not just for me, not just for the priest, but for everyone. "I will send my servant the branch. He will remove all sin in people in a day." And I got to think about this. For the years and years of the sacrifices, for the clean laws, for him to hear this prophecy would have been unbelievable. That one day it will all be over. That there will be a new great high priest that will come in and will be a sacrifice, an ultimate sacrifice to fulfill the law. To say that, look, for years, there was a certain process that needed to happen in order for you to be in the presence of God, but there will be an ultimate fulfillment of that law in the person of Jesus. Now, here's what's really cool, and this got me excited when I was reading. Joshua, Yeshua, Jesus. It's the same word in the Aramaic, in the Greek, or in the Hebrew, and the Greek, right? So there was this great high priest, Joshua, but if you fast forward to the person of Jesus, who then comes in, and it's such a reversal of what Joshua would have experienced, right? Instead of a whole crowd of friends cheering him on, like Joshua would have had, every single person who loved Jesus betrayed him, abandoned him, or denied him. And when he stood before God, instead of getting words of encouragement, he was mocked. The Father turned his face away. Instead of being clothed in wonderful garments, he was stripped naked on a cross. And the bathing, this one commentary I read was interesting. He said, well, the Passion account tells us that he was spat on. Right? There's this complete reversal. What Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made him sin who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. God clothed him as if it were our sin. He took our punishment. This is why Hebrews 13 says Jesus Christ was crucified outside the gate where the bodies are burned, where the garbage heat and absolute uncleanliness, so that we can be made clean. Here's the great news of the gospel. It's not about outside in, it's about Christ in you. So that when God sees you, he doesn't see filthy rags. He doesn't see the robe covered in excrement. When he sees you, he sees Christ on your behalf. And we now have a great high priest who takes our broken worship and is able to look pleasing in the sight of the Father. Now, I want to give you this last thing in closing to take with you. It's called the Gospel Grid. I totally lifted this from Pastor Bob Hopper back in the day. But it's really a simple way to remember this and to think about the gospel. Right? The gospel says, do not lie, right? I've been lying since I've been born, right? That's part of, I know that's something that I shouldn't do, but it's something that I do because I'm human. I can't obey the law perfectly. That's a reality. But 3, Jesus did obey this law perfectly. He did what I should but can't do as my substitute. And the fourth is that because Jesus obeyed the law perfectly and lives in me, I am now free to obey this command by his grace and power and work in me. More simply put, and if you're taking notes, want to write, I wrote this in my Bible, just it's really simple. I should, I don't, but he did, so I can. I should, but I don't. He did, so I can. Friends, this is the good news of the gospel, that Christ lived his perfect life for you, died on a cross for you, and rose again because he wasn't just a prophet, he wasn't just a moral teacher, because he was God himself. And that's really great news. And so if you're here today and you're playing religious games, feeling like you need to live to a certain standard to sort of tip the scales in your favor, may I hope you receive the freedom that the gospel provides, that it is Christ at work in you that allows us to live in the way God has called us to live. So would you put your faith in him? Put your faith in Jesus. Will you pray with me? Lord, help us to understand this not just in our head, but in our heart. We would understand the reality of what Jesus is confronting as he goes against these religious leaders who are making people feel small and insignificant and saying, you're missing the point. You're missing the point. That it is about the heart, that God's concern is with the heart. And so I pray for those who have not really believed the Christian faith before. I pray for those who are wrestling, who are questioning. Maybe they ask the right questions. Would you give them the right kind of nightmares? Would you help them to discern what it is maybe you're doing in their hearts and moving them towards the great freedom that you can have in the gospel? Would you draw them to yourself? Lord Jesus, I pray this for your beautiful name. Amen.